Forget the missiles. Forget the tanks. Forget the endless debates about NATO expansion. Tonight, we are ignoring the headlines to focus on the single, silent mechanism that destroyed Russia's ability to win this war. When Moscow initiated its invasion, the grand strategy was clinical and precise. Isolate the target. Choke the supply lines. Watch the Allies hesitate in confusion, and wait for the borders to seal under the pressure of inevitable collapse. That plan did not fail because of a battlefield error. It collapsed the moment one country made a decision that Russia never saw coming. There were no televised speeches. There were no dramatic declarations of war. There was just movement. Trains, heavy transport trucks, and warehouses lighting up in the middle of the night. Border crossings that suddenly refused to close. While Western capitals were paralyzed, debating the definition of escalation, this country was already acting as if the survival of Ukraine was synonymous with its own existence. Because, for them, it was. Stay with me, because what I am about to reveal changes the entire architecture of this conflict. That country is Poland. And if you think Poland is merely another NATO member providing standard support, you have completely missed the reality of what is happening on the ground. Geography made Poland's choice unavoidable. It sits on the fatal fault line between the Atlantic Alliance and the Russian sphere of influence. It shares a history with Moscow defined by long memories and hard lessons. When Russian armor crossed into Ukraine, Polish officials didn't see a foreign policy crisis. They saw a warning. So, instead of asking whether to help, Poland focused entirely on the velocity of that help. Within days, Poland transformed its territory into a massive logistical artery. This wasn't just about allowing weapons to transit. It was about flooding the zone. Ammunition stockpiles that took years to build were suddenly redirected east. Tanks rolled out. Artillery followed. None of this paused for a photo op. This wasn't charity. This was grand strategy. Because the moment Poland became the primary transit hub for NATO aid, it fundamentally altered the mathematics of the war. Consider the Russian dilemma. Moscow could bomb Ukrainian depots. It could target rail lines deep inside the Donbass. But it could not touch the source. The source was now anchored behind the sacred line of NATO territory. That single fact turned Poland's border into the most powerful shield Ukraine possessed. But Poland's role went deeper than hardware. When the refugee wave struck, millions of people fleeing west, it should have crippled the region. Instead of sealing the borders, Poland did something that stunned European observers. It absorbed the shock. No camps behind barbed wire. No endless bureaucratic purgatory. People were allowed to move, to work, to live. This wasn't just a humanitarian gesture, it was a stabilizing maneuver. Wars do not just collapse armies, they collapse societies. By preventing that societal collapse, Poland gave Ukraine the space to breathe, to plan, and to survive. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Polish bases became the engine room of the Ukrainian military. Soldiers rotated through for instruction, rest, and reorganization. NATO standards were transferred directly to the front lines without a single NATO flag ever crossing the border. And Moscow noticed. Russian military planners quickly realized that something was terribly wrong with their projections. Ukraine was supposed to run out of ammunition. It didn't. Units that should have been combat ineffective kept rotating back into the fight. New equipment appeared at the front sometimes faster than Russia could destroy it. The war wasn't stalling because Ukraine was stronger than expected. It was stalling because Poland was feeding the engine. At this point, Russian analysts stopped referring to Poland as a supporter and started viewing it as the logistical heart of the resistance. Western intelligence calls it a lifeline. And lifelines are dangerous things for an aggressor, because you cannot win a siege if the city keeps getting supplies. Here is where the story becomes a lesson in geopolitical brinkmanship. Poland didn't just help Ukraine survive, it helped NATO avoid direct confrontation. By acting as the bridge, Poland allowed the alliance to project massive power without crossing Russia's declared red lines. Poland became the buffer that kept the war contained while simultaneously tilting the scales against Moscow. That balance terrified the Kremlin. Attacking Polish territory would mean war with NATO. But allowing Poland to operate freely meant Ukraine could never be isolated. It was a strategic trap, and Poland stood right in the center of it. By the time Russia understood the nature of this trap, it was too late. The logistics network was entrenched. The refugee infrastructure was permanent. The weapons flow was normalized. Poland had quietly locked itself into Ukraine's war effort, not with treaties, but with reality. And here is the part that should make you pause. Poland never asked for credit. No victory laps. No dramatic claims. Just consistency. Day after day, month after month. While global attention shifted to other crises, Poland kept the lights on. This raises a question that many analysts are now whispering in private. If Poland hadn't acted the way it did, would Ukraine still be standing? From Moscow's point of view, Poland didn't just help Ukraine, Poland rewired the entire conflict. For the Kremlin, this was infuriating because it broke a rule Russia has relied on for decades, the rule of fear. The assumption that countries closest to Russia would hesitate, slow down, and calculate the cost before stepping back. Poland did the opposite. Instead of fear, it chose momentum. And momentum is dangerous because once it starts, stopping it requires escalation, something Moscow desperately wanted to avoid. Russian intelligence began reporting an uncomfortable reality. Attacks inside Ukraine were not degrading the supply chain, they were barely slowing it down. Every strike destroyed something, and something else replaced it days later. Sometimes hours later. That is when Russian planners realized the war was no longer confined to Ukrainian territory in any meaningful way. The backbone of Ukraine's resistance was sitting safely behind a NATO border, protected, organized, and untouchable. Poland wasn't improvising. This was systematic. Rail networks were optimized. Border crossings were prioritized for military logistics. Storage facilities were expanded quietly. In other words, Poland turned itself into a war engine without ever declaring war. For Russia, this was the worst-case scenario. How do you threaten a country that has already decided the threat is worth it? Every pressure tactic Moscow tried failed. Energy blackmail? Poland had already diversified. Political intimidation? Polish leadership doubled down publicly. Disinformation campaigns? They backfired, only strengthening support for Ukraine inside Poland. And here is the part most people outside Eastern Europe don't fully grasp. For Poland, this wasn't about Ukraine alone. This was about history. Poland knows what it means to be carved up by empires. It knows what happens when borders collapse and allies hesitate. It knows that waiting for someone else to act can be fatal. So when Ukraine became the buffer between Poland and Russia, Poland understood the equation instantly. If Ukraine falls, Poland becomes the front line. That awareness shaped every decision. That is why Poland moved faster than Germany, louder than France, and more decisively than countries farther west. For Poland, the war wasn't theoretical, it was geographic. And Moscow knew that too. This is why Russian rhetoric toward Poland became increasingly aggressive. Threats escalated. Military exercises near Polish borders intensified. Nuclear signaling increased. Not because Russia planned to invade Poland tomorrow, but because it wanted to scare Poland into slowing down. It didn't work. Instead, Poland leaned further in. It supported the push for heavier weapons. It backed long-range capabilities. It encouraged allies to stop drip-feeding Ukraine and start treating this as a decisive conflict. Behind closed doors, Polish officials were blunt. Half measures prolong wars. Speed ends them. This created friction inside NATO. Some allies worried Poland was pushing too hard, too fast, risking escalation. But Poland countered with a simple argument: escalation already happened the moment Russia invaded. Everything else is a response. Slowly, NATO's posture shifted closer to Poland's position. More aid, faster deliveries, fewer restrictions. Not because NATO suddenly became braver, but because Poland proved it was possible to act decisively without triggering a global catastrophe. Meanwhile, Ukrainian commanders began to rely on the Polish corridor as a certainty. They planned operations with the confidence that resupply would come, that damaged equipment could be replaced, that rotations would happen. That psychological stability is something Russia never managed to break. Wars are won as much by belief as by firepower, and Poland reinforced both. By the time the war reached this stage, one thing became impossible to deny. Poland was no longer just supporting Ukraine, Poland was shaping the outcome. This forced Russia into a corner. Escalate against Poland and risk a NATO response, or ignore Poland and allow Ukraine to remain supplied indefinitely. Neither option leads to victory. This is why analysts now say the war's tempo slowed not just because of battlefield conditions, but because Russia ran into a strategic wall it couldn't climb over. That wall wasn't built of concrete or steel. It was built of cooperation, geography, and resolve. And Poland was holding it up. But here is where it gets even more uncomfortable for Moscow. Poland didn't act alone for long. Once the lifeline proved unbreakable, others leaned in harder. Aid packages grew. Restrictions loosened. Training expanded. Fighter jet coalitions formed. The system matured. What started as emergency support turned into an ecosystem. And ecosystems are resilient. You can destroy parts of them, but they adapt. This is why Ukraine's resistance didn't collapse under pressure. It absorbed shocks, reorganized, and continued, because behind the front lines, Poland ensured there was always something to fall back on. Now ask yourself this. If Russia had successfully cut Ukraine off in the first months, would this war look anything like it does today? Most experts quietly say no. Which means Poland's early, decisive action didn't just help Ukraine survive, it prevented a fast Russian victory. And that single outcome reshaped global politics. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Wars are often decided not by who fires the most shots, but by who controls the flow. And right now, Poland controls the most important flow in this war. Supplies. Stability. Continuity. That is why analysts increasingly say Ukraine's frontline may be inside Ukraine, but its lifeline runs through Poland. And as long as that lifeline holds, Russia cannot win the war it planned. Poland didn't just protect Ukraine. It protected NATO from being forced into a direct war. By absorbing the risk early, Poland gave the alliance time to adapt, prepare, and respond on its own terms. That matters, because rushed reactions lead to disasters. Poland bought time, and time is power. So the real question going forward isn't whether Ukraine can keep fighting. It is whether Russia can find a way to change this equation without destroying the balance it fears most. And that is a gamble Moscow has failed at before.